For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan. This evening we are looking at China's response to COVID. The fact that the zero COVID policy has been given up, although never officially stated, and it appears the death toll is rising from the pictures that we see on our TV screens every day. Bodies upon bodies and crematoriums working overtime. We are going to look at what the implications are, and try and compare with what we underwent during those years when we were tackling COVID at its peak. My guest this evening is Dr. Shekhar Mande, former Director General of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. He was involved with battling the COVID pandemic during the peak. Dr. Mande, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Dr. Mande, the Chinese now appear to have given up their zero COVID policy. Death toll is going up. Is this anyway comparable to what we in India witnessed not very long ago?
So, in a sense, the strategies of China and India have been very different in tackling with the pandemic. China enforced a very strict COVID policy, zero COVID policy from beginning. While we had the lockdowns in the beginning, if you remember, March 2020, we enforced a lockdown, and our lockdown essentially was to be prepared with COVID tests and the test track strategy that has been advocated all around the world, especially by WHO. And once our lockdowns were over, we actually quickly got all our feet on ground and also prepared vaccine and everything. So in a sense, our strategy has been very different than that of China. And our strategy seems to have actually paid off to some extent, because if you look at the mortality rate, that is per million people, how many people have died, ours is among the lowest in the major economies around the world. In fact, our numbers are even better than US and Western Europe and so on and so forth.
So, what are these figures like? And what are we looking at in China in terms of the death toll, the casualty rate?
So at this stage, the situation is very fluid in China. The projections that have come yesterday, there is a mathematical modeling and all. What we are staring at something very scary, and the projection is that up to 1 million people might die in this current wave, the current wave that has come. And the current strain which is there is actually the variant of Omicron that we have already seen.
My gosh. And when you look at the measures they use to tackle this, what is your sense?
So, as I said, the strategies of India and China have been completely different. India, what happened was we, although initially forced a lockdown, then we were able to get our vaccines in place. So, January 2021, if you remember, our vaccines got formal approval from the drug controller, and we were able to vaccinate, or we were able to distribute about 2.2 billion doses of the vaccines. So most vulnerable population in India, especially those who are above the age of 60, or those who have comorbidities like diabetes or cardiac ailments, we have been able to actually vaccinate them very quickly, both the doses. And large population has also received the booster dose. Apart from this, because we did not enforce lockdowns later, unlike China, many people have seen COVID simply by going out and mixing with people and all. So what we have, what we call as a hybrid immunity, either immunity because of the vaccine that what we have taken, or immunity because of the prior exposure. Whatever low-level exposure that might have been, that exposure itself gives you immunity. While in China, their vaccination rate is much, much lower than the rest of the world. So they have not been able to vaccinate a substantial population above the age of 60, number one. Number two, because of the strict lockdowns, they have not developed this other immunity that what we see, because of the prior exposure to the disease. So the strategy that what we had adopted is way more effective, has been way more effective in tackling the pandemic than that of China.
I find, don't you find it strange, doctor, that an authoritarian country like China is not able to vaccinate all its people or even its elderly, senior citizens? It's strange, isn't it?
So the criticism that what we see around the world of China, and it's a, for me it's a hearsay because I have not been experienced it myself, is that we don't see much transparency in their tackling of the disease.
Mm.
For example, our vaccines, both Covishield and Covaxin. So Covishield, of course, was developed by AstraZeneca and Oxford Group, and in India, Serum Institute did large trials, and drug controller, when they looked at the numbers, they eventually gave permission to that, and that results have been published in journals like New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet and so on and so forth. Similarly, Covaxin was developed by Bharat Biotech in collaboration with some of the government institutes. Uh, that also results have been published. So the publication of the results gives some level of transparency. I mean, if there are any
Mhm.
problems, it has been peer reviewed. Our scientists, fellows across the world have seen the numbers, and if there are any problems, they are pointed out. The Chinese vaccine, Sinovac and all, the results have not actually come out very transparently before the peers around the world. And
Mhm.
therefore, we don't know how effective has the vaccine been. Number two, as you correctly pointed out, despite being an authoritarian country, they have not been able to cover the vulnerable population. So that only international strategy people like you would be able to comment on rather than people like me.
Mm. What is there some issue with the vaccine? I mean, we've seen so many reports that it's not effective. How are China's what is China's history in that regard? In terms of its efficacy, competence of its medical machinery, the vaccine making authorities, the certifying authorities. What is your sense of this?
So, see, I mean, the vaccines, a number of vaccines have been made around the world
Yeah.
against COVID. The Pfizer and Moderna took the way of going by mRNA method. Many people, for example, they just went by spike protein, like AstraZeneca or the Russian vaccine, what we saw.
Yeah.
In India, the Bharat Biotech took the way of taking the inactivated virus. So there are many different ways vaccines have been made, and by many different companies and others. Johnson and Johnson has made a vaccine. So these kind of things actually have been available. Now China took inactivated virus route, but along with inactivated virus, there is also an adjuvant which is supposed to boost or prime human immune response to that
Hmm.
particular inactivated virus or spike protein or something like that.
Hmm.
Uh, we don't know what kind of adjuvant Chinese use, and we don't know what the numbers of efficacy were. For example, the Bharat Biotech vaccine is close to about 80% efficacious. That means 80 out of 100 people who have received a dose are unlikely to get the disease, or rather, who also would not be hospitalized later or something like that. And
Hmm.
even the rest of the 20 others also are sufficiently protected in a sense that they may not develop a very severe kind of a disease. Now, in China, this kind of transparency has not been there, and has been a matter which has worried the scientific community around the world.
So, what is the? I mean, we've seen a lot of reports that the virus originated in Wuhan. Now, so many years later, what is the sense you are making from all the other reports that have appeared?
Yeah, the virus indeed originated in Wuhan. The origin of the virus, the principal debate has been whether it was man-made. Man-made in a sense that some experiments in the laboratory were being conducted in the lab, and the
Yeah.
virus escaped those experiments. Whether that is the possibility, or whether the virus evolved naturally in other hosts. See, viruses are known to jump from a host to host. You would have heard in the past of bird flu or a pig flu,
Yeah.
swine
Yeah.
flu, and all.
Absolutely.
So viruses jump from species to species by a process what we call as zoonosis. So this virus appears to have jumped from bats to humans through an intermediate host, and the
Hmm.
current hypothesis is that the pangolins are have been the intermediate host of that, and that appears to be the strongest possibility right now. The likelihood that it was man-made is very less, and although a lot of people have looked into the data, but still the debate rages around the world because people would like to actually fantasize or sensationalize that virus
Yeah.
might have been made in the lab.
The Chinese have also not been forthcoming, isn't it? They've been very, very secretive, refusing to give out information, perhaps even intimidating and manipulating international bodies like the WHO.
So, in a sense, WHO has always kept a very close watch from beginning. As you remember, that uh, the first outbreak was reported in Wuhan in
Yeah.
pneumonia-like cluster of pneumonia-like cases in the last week of December 2019. But by first week of January, that is within a week, the WHO team was on ground in Wuhan trying to assess what had happened. And the Chinese also actually were able to sequence the virus, identify the cause, and sequence the virus by 7th of January 2020. So, in that sense, the WHO and all have actually kept a very close watch on what is happening. But as you say correctly, everything is not very transparent in China, and scientific community has raised concerns about that in the past.
What is your sense now of the situation in China? What direction is this going to take?
So the projections that we have seen yesterday, the mathematical models and all, appear to be extremely concerning. The projection, as I said, they project that about a million people, is 10 lakh people, might die of this particular outbreak, which is extremely concerning for all of us because I mean that's a very large toll, and I just hope that doesn't happen that way. But because the Chinese have not seen hybrid immunity either through vaccination or through prior exposure, it is likely that they are actually seeing a very, very serious and concerning situation.
And this could spill over borders. I mean, what is the danger we face here in India?
So, India, we don't need to panic. Some of the other countries which have had not outbreaks in the past, for example, Japan and South Korea and all, they need to be watchful. And already we see reports now that Japan and South Korea, there have been outbreaks of the same strain as that in China. This strain spreads very fast. The R naught number of this that measures how fast the virus spreads is higher than the previous strains. In India, the situation is being watched very carefully by everyone. The government has put in place the sequencing and all those things and testing, tracking in place once again. So we don't need to panic. We don't need to actually really raise a red flag right now. What we need to do is we need to actually be watchful and we need to promote appropriate behavior amongst public all over again. For example, wearing masks in public, avoid crowding. So they're the kind of things that we need to promote. One of the things that emerged through our own work when I was in CSIR was virus essentially spreads through air droplets, what we call as an airborne virus. And therefore, the likelihood that the virus would spread much in outdoor spaces is less. The likelihood that it will spread in indoor spaces which are less ventilated is more.
I
And
see.
therefore, to reduce the probability, what we promote is have the buildings very well ventilated. If you are inside the house, outside the house, take normal precautions that keep wearing masks. Masks are the best way of contacting the virus, preventing contact the virus.
Uh-huh. What about the vaccination? We've all had a booster dose. Do you expect that perhaps in New Year we may have to go in for another round?
So those who have been doubly vaccinated can be more relaxed about it. The people who are vulnerable population, those who are above 60, those with cardiac disorders, those with diabetes, those with obesity, they may wish to take the booster as early as possible. Others may wait and watch, but it's desirable to take a booster at some point of time.
But do you think, even otherwise, given the fact that the vaccine doesn't last long, I'm told, no more than about 3 to 6 months, um, are repeat doses, more in that sense recommended?
No, so scientifically, it has not really been proven that the immunity is not beyond 3 to 6 months, as you said.
Hmm.
So, what we believe is that there is some immunity that persists, and therefore, if you are doubly vaccinated, it might be still okay. What has been observed is that if you mix vaccines, that is, if you have taken AstraZeneca earlier, that is the Serum Institute, and
Mhm.
then later on, after taking 2 doses, if you take a booster of, let us say, Covaxin, that actually might be a better strategy. Once
Mhm.
again, scientific studies are on at this stage, but the mixing vaccine appears to be a good strategy as well in this case. But a booster would be desirable at some point of time.
Mhm. So even those who have got a booster shot, perhaps may have to go in for another booster in the new year.
Uh, Depending on when they have taken the booster, if they've taken the booster in last 6 to 8 months, I don't think they
Mm.
need to worry too much about it.
Uh-huh, I see. I see. So they can last the whole of next year without anything.
My guess is that, but as I said, the controlled scientific studies have not really proven any of these things.
Mhm. So, what about border controls and restrictions on air passage of people coming from China, going to China? Do you think the time has come now to ensure those protocols are in place?
Yes, so my personal opinion, and of course, government will take a very considered call on this in the coming couple of days, I guess.
Hmm.
My personal opinion is that the passengers coming into India may actually be screened, either RT-PCR or whatever, and if they are positive, they should be isolated immediately and quarantined. But stopping the inflow or outflow of passengers may not be desirable, in my
Mhm.
personal view.
Mhm. This current strain in China, is it more virulent, more damaging?
So the current strain is a variant of Omicron that we have heard of earlier.
Yeah.
Is R naught. That is the number of people an infected person can spread the disease to is much higher than
Hmm.
the previous strains. So it spreads faster in a population because its R naught is higher. But it's a variant of Omicron.
Hmm. So, in that sense, we are familiar with it. We're not going to panic, and there's no need for that.
Absolutely right. We don't need to panic at all. But we need to maintain COVID appropriate behavior.
Mhm. What about, I mean, is it natural for these viruses to constantly mutate and come back in a stronger form?
Oh, yes. So, any virus, if you look at, what happens is that there is some sort of a tug of war that is happening. When the
Mm.
virus enters its host, in this case humans, the human immune system is sufficiently capable of getting rid of the virus. Now, viruses, what happens is that to be able to sustain in the human body, they mutate and try to fool human immune system. So there is
Mhm.
always a tug of war between the host and the pathogen. There's not virus alone, but any kind of pathogen. There's a tug of
Mhm.
war, and both are trying to win at the same time, you know. And therefore virus adopts a strategy of adopting or acquiring fast mutations so that it can survive in the human body. That's what the virus
Mhm.
tries to do. On the other hand, the human body naturally launches an immune response against the
Mhm.
virus and tries to clear it. So the viruses naturally mutate. All viruses, we have seen influenza viruses, they mutate and all. So all viruses have the tendency to mutate.
Mhm. There is this influenza vaccination that is going around. Is that effective?
So influenza virus vaccination is effective. Many countries they do every time before the onset of the season. There's a particular
Mm.
season in which there is influenza outbreaks around the
Yeah.
world, and many people do actually take because in many countries, especially in US and all, the influenza mortality is pretty high. So it's advocated to take influenza virus vaccine there.
Doctor, you mentioned that in developed countries, the mortality rate was higher because possibly their immune systems were compromised by all the hygiene and sanitation around them. So, what is your recommendation to Indians?
No, no, I have no recommendations. I had my own hypothesis, which is fairly controversial,
Mm.
and that is my hypothesis. My own hypothesis was because we have been continuously exposed to different kinds of pathogens since our childhood,
Yeah.
we don't hyper react to incoming pathogen. I mean, this particular virus, the cause of death has been the hyper reaction of our body to the virus and not the
Mhm.
virus itself. See, the body clears the virus roughly about 8th or 10th day after being infected. I mean,
Yeah.
if you do RT-PCR after 10th day, in most people, the count comes down dramatically. Most
Mm.
people, I'm not saying all of them.
Yeah.
But what sets in at that time is the hyperimmune reaction, or what is popularly called as the cytokine storm.
Mhm.
And the cytokine storm is the one which eventually leads to pneumonia like a condition in the lungs, where we actually start losing our breathing ability and oxygen uptake ability. And the people essentially die because of that, because we don't uptake enough oxygen. My hypothesis was that we have been continuously exposed to different pathogens, so we don't hyperreact, while people who have not been exposed to the external pathogens for long, they don't hyperreact. Now, if you see, therefore, one of the outcomes of this particular hypothesis has been that many of the autoimmune disorders, for example, asthma percentage, if you see in the advanced economies, Western Europe, US, and all, uh, there's a larger percentage of people who have disorders such as asthma or autoimmune disorders and things like that than those in countries like Africa or Southeast Asia or South Asia in general. And that's because, once again, of the same problem that we don't hyperreact to incoming pathogens.
So that is the body's natural immune response.
That's right. That's right. But this hypothesis, of course, I mean, there will be debates around this. I don't think this hypothesis is very well accepted by everyone. So there will
Mhm.
also always be debates around this particular hypothesis. But I am one side of the hypothesis. I believe that we are better protected than the population in US or Western Europe.
Do you think that what we saw, 2 years ago, at the peak of the virus, could that situation recur?
Very unlikely. In India, it's very, very unlikely. In China, it's likely right now that such a situation might arise.
Would you expect the Chinese would seek advice maybe from India, because in terms of population size, they're closest to us.
I'm not sure. I think people like you would know that better whether China would seek our help or not.
Yeah.
But being belonging to scientific fraternity, I do believe that all of us must extend our hand of help to
Yeah.
countries like China, because we have very high capacity of manufacturing vaccines which have been shown to be efficacious and efficient. And
Yeah.
therefore, as a fellow human being, we as a country must extend our hand to Chinese authorities, saying that we have companies which can produce large amounts of doses, and India as a country should stand shoulder to shoulder to say that if help is needed, we'll be happy to produce and give that to China.
Doctor, one last question. I mean, it keeps coming, occurs in my mind that in this Chinese structure, where there is this thing happening on the ground, and perhaps there's not enough feedback going up. I don't know if you've ever had occasion to interact with your colleagues in China, whether you had an occasion to study their medical system and how it works.
I have not had chance to talk to anyone about this. I mean, till now, but all I know is about the hearsays that most people actually say that the system is very hierarchical and it's very closed door, in a sense that the transparency is not as much as what we have here.
So, last word. We've been very, very open about the COVID as it hit us. Would you say that?
COVID, as pardon me.
When it hit us, we've been as transparent as we could be, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we did everything openly, and Government of India's programs were actually being monitored by everyone. We were vaccinating people. People were coming to hospitals, and in remote locations, we were actually taking vaccines in remote locations, and we delivered vaccines in those places.
Yeah.
So we have been pretty open about it. We have faced criticism from media, especially Western media, about how we tackled. But I
Yeah.
think that's part of the game, and we should live up to that particular criticism and say that we have done everything as openly as possible. I think we should be very proud of how we have tackled the pandemic compared to many other countries in the world.
On that note, Dr. Mande, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure talking to you, and thank you for all that insight.
Thank you so much.
And for those of you who are tuning into this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel and do follow us on our social media, Instagram and Twitter. Thank you and good night.